At exactly 7:42 p.m. on my 26th birthday, my mother raised her champagne glass, looked me straight in the eyes, and said 3 words she had repeated for 497 days of my life. You were a mistake. There were 42 people standing in the backyard of the house I had paid for. 16 candles burned on the custom 3-tier cake I ordered myself because no one else ever remembered. And not one person, not my father, not my brother, not my fiancé, said a single word to stop her. If you've ever been the kind of daughter who spends her whole life trying to earn a love that never comes, you already know what that silence feels like. Before I continue, tell me this in the comments. Have you ever realized you were never actually loved, only tolerated? Because that was the night I finally understood something cold and irreversible. They never saw me as their daughter, only as their family's permanent error. My name is Elena Marie Caldwell. I'm 26 years old, born and raised in Scottsdale, Arizona. I work as a forensic accountant, specializing in corporate fraud investigations. Ironic considering I spent my entire childhood living inside the biggest emotional fraud of all. But to understand what happened that night, you need to know what it meant to grow up as the mistake. The nickname started before I could speak. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, liked to tell the story at every holiday gathering like it was a charming anecdote. She'd laugh lightly while guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. We weren't supposed to have another child, she'd say. Daniel had just made partner at the firm we'd moved into the new house. And then surprise Elena happened. She always said happened the way people talk about an unexpected leak in the ceiling. Not a person, a problem. My father, Daniel Robert Caldwell, never corrected her. He'd just give a tight smile and take a sip of his whiskey, as if he'd learned long ago that silence was easier than kindness. By the time I was 6, the phrase had evolved into something sharper. You're our little accident, my brother Matthew would tease, mimicking our parents' tone. He was 4 years older, golden-haired straight-A student, varsity everything, the planned child, the heir, the one who fit. I was the disruption. I learned early that love in our house was conditional, measured in performance, compliance, and invisibility. If I brought home a 100 on a test, my mother would say, "Good, that's expected." If I got a 98, she'd ask, "What happened to the other 2 points?" If I cried, she'd sigh, "You're so dramatic." This is why we weren't ready for another child. By 12, I stopped crying in front of them altogether. By 16, I had perfected the art of becoming emotionally invisible. I worked 2 part-time jobs through high school, even though my family had more than enough money. My father was a senior partner at Caldwell and Briggs LLP, earning over $800, a year. But he insisted that mistakes should learn independence early. He paid Matthew's full tuition to Stanford. I took out $62, in student loans to attend Arizona State. That was the first time I asked him why. I still remember the exact moment. We were standing in his home office mahogany desk, leather-bound law books, the faint smell of cigars embedded into the walls. He didn't even look up from his paperwork when I asked, "Dad, why is it different for me?" He paused for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said calmly, "Because life is different for you, Elena. You weren't part of the plan." That sentence lodged inside me like a piece of glass that never dissolved. But the strangest part, I still spent the next 10 years trying to earn their approval. I graduated summa cum laude. I built a career where I could track missing money down to the cent. At 24, I purchased a $610, home entirely on my own. No help, no co-signers. And 2 months later, when my parents complained about rising property taxes on their retirement property, I offered something I had never received in return. I let them move in with me. If that sounds insane to you, trust me, I've replayed that decision 1,000 times. But when you grow up, as the mistake, you start to believe love can be earned through sacrifice. I thought if I gave enough, fixed enough, proved enough, one day they would finally say the words I'd waited my whole life to hear. "We're proud of you." Instead, what they said on my 26th birthday was something else entirely. The party itself had been my fiancé's idea. Ryan Mitchell, 32, real estate developer, charming in the polished magazine cover way, insisted I deserved a proper celebration. He invited everyone, my coworkers, my extended family, even a few of his business partners. I remember standing in the backyard that evening, watching string lights sway in the warm desert air, thinking for the first time in my life that maybe things were finally changing. Maybe I had built something separate from the old wounds. Maybe I was finally safe. Then my mother clinked her glass. She stood smiling in that polished, socially acceptable way she'd perfected over decades. "I just want to make a little toast," she said. Her voice was light, playful, cruel in a way only I seemed to recognize immediately. 26 years ago, she continued our lives, took an unexpected turn. We weren't ready for another baby. We had plans, goals, a vision. People laughed politely, thinking it was harmless storytelling. Then she looked directly at me. "You were never supposed to happen, Elena." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but she wasn't finished. "And honestly," she said, tilting her head slightly, "you've always felt like the family's little defect, haven't you?" That was the word, defect. I saw Ryan's hand tighten around his drink. I saw my father stare silently into his glass. I saw my brother smirk just slightly before looking away. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It went cold. Because for the first time in my life, I noticed something I had missed for years. Ryan didn't look shocked. He looked unsurprised, as if he'd heard all of this before, as if this wasn't new information to him at all. And then a few seconds later, he said something quietly to my father that I couldn't hear, but whatever it was, made my father nod. That was the moment I realized there was something much bigger happening than a cruel birthday toast. Something planned, something coordinated, and something that had absolutely nothing to do with whether I was loved. It had to do with something else entirely. Something worth a lot more than affection. Something worth millions. I just didn't know what it was yet. At 9:13 p.m., exactly 91 minutes after my mother called me a defect in front of 42 guests, I walked into my kitchen to get a glass of water and overheard my fiancé whispering to my father about a number that made my hands go completely numb. 2.8 million, Ryan said quietly. That's the current valuation. My father responded with a low, satisfied hum, and neither of them knew I was standing just 6 feet away, frozen behind the pantry door. If you've ever had a moment where your entire reality shifts in less than 10 seconds, you know the exact kind of stillness I'm talking about. The kind where your brain doesn't panic, it calculates. Because that's what I've trained my mind to do for the last 8 years. Follow numbers, detect inconsistencies, and find out where the money is really going. I just never expected I'd have to do it inside my own home. Before I go further, let me ask you something. If you overheard the 2 people you trusted, most discussing millions of dollars behind your back, would you confront them immediately? Or would you stay silent and listen? Because that choice determines everything that happens next. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Ryan leaned against the kitchen counter, his voice low and confident. "Once she signs after the wedding, it'll transfer cleanly," he said. "No complications." My father asked, "And she still doesn't know about the clause?" Ryan chuckled softly. "No. Elena reads everything when it comes to work, but when it's personal, she trusts too easily." That sentence landed harder than any insult my mother had ever thrown at me. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. I stayed completely still as my father took a slow sip of his drink. "Good," he said calmly. "We've waited long enough. After all, we're entitled to recover what we lost raising her." Recover what we lost raising her. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. But then Ryan added something that erased all doubt. The trust will convert into joint marital assets within 30 days. Once that happens, liquidation is straightforward. Trust. My stomach dropped. Because there was only one trust connected to my name. One I had never been able to access. One I was told my entire life didn't actually exist. And suddenly, a memory surfaced with crystal clarity. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework, when I overheard my parents arguing in my father's office. My mother's voice had been sharp and urgent. "She doesn't need to know about the inheritance," she said. "It's cleaner if we handle it ourselves." My father had responded firmly. "It's locked until she turns 26. Legally, we can't touch it." At the time, I didn't understand what they meant. When I asked later, my mother brushed it off. "You misheard," she said coldly. "There is no inheritance. Don't be ridiculous." I believed her, because children believe what they need to survive. Standing in my kitchen 18 years later, I realized something terrifying. That argument had been real, and they had been lying ever since. Ryan's voice pulled me back into the present. "We just need to make sure she signs the updated financial disclosure before the wedding," he said. "After that, everything moves automatically." My father asked one final question. "And if she refuses?" Ryan didn't hesitate. "She won't," he said. "Elena still wants their approval more than anything. She always has." That was when something inside me shifted permanently. Not in a dramatic emotional way, but in the quiet, irreversible way ice forms over water. Because for the first time in my life, I saw my role in their eyes with perfect clarity. Not daughter, not partner, not even a person. An asset, a delayed payout, a financial inconvenience they had been waiting 26 years to monetize. I stepped away from the pantry before they could notice me and walked upstairs slowly, my heart beating with unnatural steadiness. Not panic, precision. That's the difference between someone who reacts emotionally and someone trained to investigate fraud. By the time I reached my bedroom, I had already started building a timeline in my head. Age 0, 26, emotional conditioning and dependency. Age 26, legal access to an unknown trust. Upcoming wedding mechanism for asset transfer. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. And patterns are never accidental in financial crimes. They are designed. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the framed engagement photo on my nightstand. Ryan's arm wrapped around me, both of us smiling, looking from the outside like a perfectly balanced partnership. But suddenly, I noticed something I had overlooked before. In that photo, I was leaning toward him. He wasn't leaning toward me at all. He was standing straight, stable, as if he already knew exactly where he stood, and where I didn't. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me do what I always do when something doesn't add up. I opened my laptop, because here's the thing about financial lies. They always leave records. Always. The question isn't whether proof exists. The question is whether you're willing to find it. As I logged into my secure database, another memory surfaced. 2 months ago, a law firm in Phoenix had contacted me by certified mail. I had almost thrown the envelope away, assuming it was routine documentation. But now, remembering the sender's name made my pulse slow deliberately. Harrington and Cole estate attorneys. At the time, I never opened the letter. It was still sitting unopened in my filing cabinet downstairs. And suddenly, I understood why my parents had been watching me so closely all week. Why Ryan had insisted on planning my birthday party. Why everyone seemed to be waiting for something. They weren't celebrating me turning 26. They were celebrating the moment something unlocked. Something they believed they were about to take. What they didn't know yet was that they had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed I was still the same girl who spent her life begging for their approval. They forgot what I actually do for a living. I don't just find missing money. I expose the people who try to steal it. And as I walked downstairs toward the filing cabinet, one thought echoed with absolute certainty in my mind. If there was a trust in my name, it meant someone, somewhere, had intended for me to be protected, which raised one question that changed everything. Who had created it? And why had my parents been so desperate to hide it from me for 26 years? At 10:02 p.m., while my guests were still laughing under the backyard string lights, I slid a silver letter opener under the seal of an envelope that had been sitting untouched in my filing cabinet for 63 days and discovered a document that explained exactly why my parents had called me a mistake my entire life. Because I wasn't supposed to exist, at least not legally. If that sentence just made your stomach drop a little, stay with me. Because when I read the first page of that letter, mine did too. The envelope was thick, heavy stock, embossed with a Navy crest, Harrington, and Cole Estate Attorneys, Phoenix, Arizona. The kind of firm that handles wealth preservation generational trusts and high-value inheritance disputes. The kind of firm ordinary families never interact with. My hands didn't shake when I opened it. Years of forensic work had trained me to keep steady, even when reading evidence that destroyed companies' marriages and sometimes entire lives. But nothing prepares you to analyze your own life like a fraud case. The first page was a formal notification letter. Dear Miss Elena Marie Caldwell, this correspondence serves as official notice that you have reached the legal age of access to the Hawthorne Irrevocable Trust, established on March 14, 1999. Effective immediately upon your 26th birthday, you are entitled to full disclosure of its terms, assets, and governance history. I read that paragraph 3 times. March 14, 1999. I was born May 22, 1999. That meant the trust had been created 2 months before I even existed, which meant one thing: it was never meant to be a reaction to me being born. It was planned. Below the letter was a summary sheet. Current trust valuation, $2, 873, 411.52. Asset composition, A, 1.4 million in diversified index holdings, 850,000 in municipal bonds, 400,000 in real estate equity interests, 223,411 in liquid reserves. Total administrative withdrawals since inception, $0. My breath slowed into something almost mechanical. No withdrawals, no transfers, untouched for 26 years. That alone told me something critical. My parents had never had legal access to it. They hadn't just hidden it from me. They had been blocked from it. And that meant whoever created this trust had done so very intentionally. There was a second document underneath titled Governance Conditions. I scanned the bullet points quickly. Beneficiary, Elena Marie Caldwell. Trust protector, Evelyn Hawthorne. My eyes stopped on that name because I had heard it before. Exactly once, when I was 9 years old, I had found an old photograph tucked into a book in my parents' study. It showed a woman in her late 50s, silver hair, sharp eyes, standing beside a much younger version of my father. I asked my mother who she was. My mother's face went completely cold. That woman is nobody, she said flatly. Don't ask about her again. I never did, because in our house, some topics didn't just get discouraged. They got erased. Now, staring at the name, printed clearly in legal typeface, I realized that wasn't true. Evelyn Hawthorne wasn't nobody. She was the person who controlled the trust, which meant she was the person who had protected it from my parents for 26 years. I flipped to the next page. Trust conditions for beneficiary access. Beneficiary must reach age 26. Beneficiary must not be under financial guardianship. Beneficiary must personally acknowledge trust activation with Harrington and Cole estate attorneys. Then came a final clause, one that made my pulse slow into something dangerously calm. Protective provision 7A. In the event of attempted coercion, manipulation, or fraudulent marital asset transfer involving the beneficiary, the trust protector retains authority to suspend distributions and initiate legal intervention. I read that line twice, then a third time, because that clause told me something my parents and Ryan clearly didn't know. Someone had anticipated exactly what they were planning. Someone had built a legal tripwire decades in advance, and that someone had known my parents well enough to predict they might try to exploit me financially, which raised a question that chilled me more than anything else. What had my parents done in the past that made someone go to such extreme lengths to protect a child who wasn't even born yet? Before I could process that, I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Ryan's voice followed. "Elena, are you in here?" His tone was casual, warm, the same voice he'd used for 3 years, while planning a future that apparently had never been about love at all. I slid the documents back into the envelope smoothly and closed the drawer just as he stepped into the room. He smiled when he saw me. "There you are," he said lightly. "Everyone's asking where you went." I studied his face carefully. For the first time, I wasn't seeing my fiancé. I was seeing a man who had been discussing my financial liquidation plan with my father less than an hour ago. And the strangest part, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear, like solving a puzzle whose pieces had finally snapped into place. He walked closer, leaning casually against the desk. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay? Your mom's speech was a little harsh." A little harsh. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked something very simple. "Ryan," I said evenly, "do you believe I trust you completely?" He didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't you?" Because that answer told me exactly what he thought of me. Predictable, emotionally dependent, easy to manipulate. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. "We're going to build a great life together," he said gently. "You just have to let me handle the complicated stuff." Handle the complicated stuff. The words echoed in my mind long after he left the room. Because in forensic accounting, there's one principle we follow above all else. When someone insists, you don't need to understand the details. That's exactly where the fraud is hiding. I waited until his footsteps disappeared downstairs. Then I opened the envelope again and pulled out the final page. At the bottom, beneath the legal text, was a handwritten note. Not typed, not printed, written in firm, deliberate pen strokes. "Elena, if you are reading this, it means you have survived long enough to learn the truth they tried to bury. You were never a mistake. You were the reason this trust had to exist. When you are ready, contact me directly. There is much you still don't know about what your parents did before you were born. Evelyn." My fingers tightened around the paper because suddenly the situation wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even just about betrayal. It was about something older, something hidden, something serious enough that someone had been preparing for this moment for over a quarter of a century. And for the first time in my life, I realized a terrifying possibility. What if my parents hadn't called me a mistake because I was unwanted? What if they called me that because my existence had ruined something they desperately wanted to keep secret? At 6:18 a.m., the morning after my birthday, while the rest of my household was still asleep, I sat alone at my dining table with a cup of black coffee, a legal envelope worth $2.8 million, and one question repeating in my mind with clinical precision. What exactly had my existence ruined for my parents? I hadn't slept at all, not because I was overwhelmed, but because once you realize you're standing inside a financial deception, decades in the making, sleep becomes inefficient. Analysis becomes urgent. and there was a lot to analyze. The timeline alone didn't make sense. The trust had been created on March 14th, 1999. I wasn't born until May 22nd, which meant someone had anticipated my arrival 2 months before it happened. That alone ruled out coincidence. Trusts like this aren't created casually. They involve weeks of legal drafting, asset transfers, and multi-party verification. Whoever set this up had known something significant was coming and had acted quickly to secure resources before anyone else could interfere, which raised an uncomfortable but unavoidable possibility. My parents hadn't just hidden the trust. They might have tried to stop it. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. If you discovered that someone had secretly protected you, your entire life, from the very people who raised you, would you feel relieved or terrified? Because sitting there in the quiet morning light, I felt both, and something else too. Anger, but not the loud kind. The quiet, strategic kind that builds plans instead of explosions. I opened my laptop and began doing what I always do when a case begins. I built a timeline. March 1999, trust established. May 1999, I am born. Age 0, 18. Emotional neglect and financial restriction. Age 1826. Total secrecy about any inheritance. Age 26. Parents and fiancé attempt coordinated asset access. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't just emotional cruelty. It was controlled isolation. Because here's something most people don't realize. Financial dependency is one of the most effective long-term control mechanisms in abusive family systems. And my parents had applied it perfectly. They limited my access to resources, forced me into early financial independence, maintained emotional instability, and most importantly, kept me unaware of the one asset that could have made me fully autonomous years earlier. Which meant they hadn't just resented me, they had needed me to remain vulnerable. At exactly 6:42 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. My father was an early riser, always had been. I closed the laptop and slid the envelope under a stack of work files just as he walked into the kitchen. He poured himself coffee without acknowledging me at first. That was typical. We'd spent decades existing in parallel rather than connection. But today, I watched him differently, not as a distant parent, as a potential subject of investigation. He finally glanced at me. "You were quiet last night," he said. His tone was neutral, controlled, lawyerly. I met his eyes evenly. "I was thinking," I said. He nodded slowly. "About your mother's toast." That question told me something immediately. He wasn't concerned about my feelings. He was testing whether the public humiliation had destabilized me. It hadn't, so I answered truthfully, but not completely. "No," I said calmly, "about something older." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something cross his face. Not guilt, not regret, alarm. He recovered quickly. "What do you mean?" he asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "When I was a kid, I said I overheard you and Mom arguing about an inheritance." His hand tightened around his coffee mug, just slightly. Most people wouldn't notice, but I specialize in reading micro-reactions during financial depositions. Silence stretched between us. Then he said something very carefully. "You must have misunderstood." There it was, immediate denial. Step 1 of every defensive pattern. I tilted my head. "Did I asked softly. His eyes hardened. "There was never any inheritance," he said firmly. "You're imagining things." That sentence landed with a clarity I hadn't felt before. Because I knew with absolute certainty now it was a lie. And when someone lies that quickly and decisively, it means they've practiced the denial many times before. I didn't push further. Because in fraud investigations, the first confrontation isn't about getting answers. It's about confirming behavior patterns. And his reaction confirmed exactly what I needed. He was afraid of this topic, which meant it wasn't just about money. It was about exposure. He took a slow sip of coffee. "You should focus on your wedding," he said. Ryan is a good man. He'll help you manage your future responsibly. There was the pivot, back to control, back to positioning Ryan as the handler of my assets. I looked at him steadily. Do you trust Ryan completely? I asked. The question seemed to surprise him, but he answered without hesitation. Yes, too quickly, too confidently, which meant one thing. They had been aligned on this for a long time. After he left the kitchen, I sat motionless for several minutes, replaying every detail of that conversation, because something in his reaction didn't match simple greed. It matched fear, deep historical fear. And fear like that doesn't come from a hidden trust alone. It comes from something much bigger. At 8:05 a.m., while the house was finally empty, I pulled the envelope back out and dialed the number printed at the bottom of Evelyn Hawthorne's handwritten note. It rang twice. Then a calm, older woman's voice answered. Elena, she said, before I could speak. She knew exactly who I was, which meant she had been expecting this call for years. My throat tightened slightly, but my voice stayed steady. I read the documents, I said. There was a pause. Then she said something that changed the entire scope of what I thought this situation was. Good, she replied quietly, because what your parents tried to do to you last night is exactly why I had to stop them once before. My heart skipped a beat. Once before. That meant this wasn't their first attempt. I forced myself to stay calm. What do you mean? I asked. Her next words landed like a quiet detonation. 26 years ago, she said your parents didn't just resent your existence, Elena. They tried to make sure you would never have one at all. And in that moment, I realized something that made everything else, the insults, the neglect, the manipulation, look small by comparison. My parents hadn't called me a mistake because I ruined their plans. They called me that because I was the one thing they had failed to eliminate. At 8:07 a.m., exactly 2 minutes after Evelyn Hawthorne told me my parents had once tried to make sure I would never have an existence at all, I stopped breathing for just long enough to understand one terrifying truth. This wasn't just about emotional abuse. It was about survival. For a moment, I didn't speak. Because when someone drops a statement, that severe one that implies intent to erase a human life before it begins, your mind doesn't immediately react with emotion. It reacts with verification. Years of forensic training kicked in automatically. I needed specifics, evidence, timeline. Before I go further, let me ask you something. If someone told you that your own parents once tried to prevent you from being born, not accidentally, but deliberately, would you demand proof immediately? Or would part of you already know it was true? Because deep down, something inside me had always sensed that my family's hostility wasn't normal. It was disproportionate, cold in a way that didn't match simple disappointment. Now, for the first time, it was starting to make sense. I forced my voice to remain steady. What exactly do you mean? I asked into the phone. Evelyn Hawthorne didn't hesitate. Her tone wasn't emotional. It was factual, precise, like someone who had spent decades documenting something she never wanted to forget. Your mother's pregnancy with you, she said, calmly, was never meant to continue. The words landed like ice. I closed my eyes briefly, but didn't interrupt. She continued. In early March 1999, your father came to me for legal consultation. At the time, I was the senior estate partner at Harrington, and Cole and I had known Daniel Caldwell professionally for years. I pictured my father at 35, ambitious, polished, already calculating. He told me, she said, that Patricia had discovered she was pregnant unexpectedly, and they were exploring options to ensure their financial stability. Financial stability. The phrase made my jaw tighten. Even then, everything was framed in monetary terms. Evelyn's voice lowered slightly. But during our meeting, I realized something was very wrong. I leaned forward, unconsciously. What do you mean? I asked. There was a pause. Then she said the sentence that shifted the entire narrative of my life. Because Daniel didn't ask about legal procedures for family planning, she said quietly. He asked how to legally ensure that a child, if born, would never be able to claim inheritance rights. My fingers went cold, not emotional, physical, because that wasn't about avoiding parenthood. That was about preemptive disinheritance, which meant something very specific in legal terms. They had believed I might have a claim to something they didn't want to share. I swallowed carefully. And what did you tell him? I asked. Evelyn's voice hardened slightly for the first time. I told him it wasn't possible to preemptively erase a child's legal rights without evidence of extraordinary circumstances, she said. Which is when he revealed something else. Silence stretched for a moment. Then she spoke again. Your father wasn't worried about raising another child, Elena. He was terrified that you would inherit something that didn't belong to him. That sentence snapped the final piece into place. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The secrecy, the resentment, the emotional punishment. It had never been about me being unwanted. It had been about me being a legal threat. My voice dropped to a whisper. What was I supposed to inherit? Evelyn answered immediately. Your maternal grandfather's estate. My breath caught. Maternal. That meant someone from my mother's side of the family. Someone I had never met. Someone my mother had never once mentioned in my entire life. His name was Arthur Hawthorne, she said. And suddenly, the last name clicked. Hawthorne. Her last name. Which meant, you're related to him, I said, slowly. Yes, she replied. He was my older brother. My heart pounded now, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was unfolding. Arthur Hawthorne. The name stirred something faint in my memory. A newspaper headline I had once seen in an archive database years ago during a case. Hawthorne Industrial Systems, a manufacturing empire in Arizona, worth hundreds of millions in the 1990s. I spoke carefully. He was wealthy. Yes, she said simply. And he had only one child. My throat tightened. My mother. Yes. The silence that followed carried the weight of 26 years of buried truth. Then Evelyn said something that clarified everything. Your mother was disinherited in 1997 after she and your father attempted to force Arthur to transfer ownership of the company under fraudulent conditions. My hands clenched around the phone. Fraudulent conditions. That was a phrase with very specific legal meaning. It implied documentation, evidence, intent. They tried to coerce him, I asked quietly. More than that, Evelyn said. They attempted to falsify medical incapacity documents to claim he was unfit to manage his estate. My heart pounded now, because that wasn't just unethical. That was felony-level financial exploitation. What happened? I asked. Her voice softened slightly. My brother discovered the attempt, she said. He removed Patricia from his will entirely and established a protected inheritance structure for any future grandchild, specifically to prevent your parents from accessing it. I felt like the ground beneath my entire childhood had just shifted. They hadn't called me a mistake because I ruined their lives. They called me that because my existence had permanently locked them out of a fortune they had tried to steal. And suddenly, every cruel word from my mother took on a new meaning. You were never supposed to happen. Not emotionally, financially. Because if I had never been born, they would have had a second chance to claim the estate. I forced myself to ask the next question. Did they try to stop the pregnancy? I said quietly. Evelyn's voice was steady. Yes, she said. But your grandfather intervened. My pulse spiked. How? There was a long pause before she answered. By threatening to expose their attempted fraud to the Arizona State Bar, she said, which would have ended your father's legal career permanently. The room seemed to tilt slightly, because that meant something very clear. My existence wasn't just an inconvenience to my parents. It had been a legal shield that protected their reputations. They hadn't kept me alive out of love. They had kept me alive out of self-preservation. And suddenly, a chilling thought surfaced. If they had once been willing to attempt something that extreme, what might they be willing to do now, 26 years later, when the inheritance they failed to steal had finally become accessible? Before I could speak again, Evelyn added something that sent a cold wave through my chest. "Elena," she said quietly, "there's something else you need to understand." My voice was barely above a whisper. "What?" "The reason I included that protective clause in your trust," she said, "is because your parents didn't just try to take your grandfather's estate once." She paused, then delivered the sentence that changed everything again. "They tried again 6 months ago." And suddenly, I realized the birthday party, the engagement pressure, the coordinated conversations. It wasn't just opportunistic. It was part of a plan they had already attempted once before. A plan that had failed, a plan they were now trying again. And this time, they thought they had finally found the perfect way to make sure it would succeed. At 8:22 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after Evelyn told me my parents had attempted to access my grandfather's estate again, just 6 months earlier, I sat perfectly still, with the phone pressed to my ear, and realized something deeply unsettling. I had never noticed the attack happening. Not once. For someone whose entire career revolved around detecting financial manipulation, that realization landed like a professional failure more than a personal one. Because here's the thing about long-term fraud schemes, they don't begin with obvious theft. They begin with subtle positioning, trust building, legal groundwork, and suddenly, the timeline of my own life over the past year started rearranging itself in my mind, like pieces sliding into their correct places. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the person didn't just betray you once? They were preparing for it the entire time. Because that's exactly what was happening here. And I had missed it. Evelyn spoke again, her voice steady. "In August of last year, she said your parents contacted our firm, requesting clarification on trust governance conditions." My pulse slowed into investigative focus. "That doesn't sound unusual," I said carefully. "It would be normal," she replied, "if they were listed parties. But they aren't. They never had legal standing to request information. That meant they had tried to gain access indirectly, a common early-stage tactic in inheritance fraud cases." "What reason did they give?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "They claimed you were experiencing financial instability and might require family assistance managing your assets." I let out a slow breath, because that was a complete fabrication. At that time, I had just closed my most profitable corporate investigation contract, earning over $180,000 in a single quarter. Financial instability wasn't just inaccurate. It was strategically constructed misinformation. "They were attempting to trigger a guardianship review," Evelyn said quietly. My stomach tightened, because that was serious. In Arizona, financial guardianship allows designated parties to oversee an individual's assets if they are deemed incapable of managing them independently. And once established, it can override trust protections. "They tried to legally declare me incapable?" I asked. "Yes," she said, "but they failed." I closed my eyes briefly, not in relief, in calculation, because that meant something very important. They hadn't just planned to take the inheritance after my birthday. They had first tried to position themselves as legal controllers of it. And when that failed, they pivoted to another strategy, marriage, which suddenly made Ryan's role painfully clear. I spoke slowly. "That's why they supported my engagement so aggressively." "Yes," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Marital asset conversion is one of the most common secondary strategies when direct guardianship fails." The phrase felt clinical, transactional, and that was exactly what my relationship had been, a financial access pathway. I swallowed carefully. "Did Ryan know about the trust before he met me?" I asked. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Then she said something that made my chest go cold. Yes, the word landed with brutal clarity. He was introduced to you intentionally, she continued, through a business networking event arranged by your father. My mind flashed back to the exact moment Ryan and I met, 3 years ago, at a charity gala hosted by Caldwell and Briggs LLP. My father had insisted I attend, saying it was good professional exposure. Ryan had approached me that night with a warm smile and easy confidence. We had talked for hours. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, my life, my perspective. Now, replaying that memory with this new information, I noticed something I had overlooked before. He hadn't approached randomly. He had been waiting near the registration desk, watching until I arrived. I felt something inside me shift, not heartbreak, not even anger. Clarity? Because love doesn't feel like strategy. And suddenly, everything about our relationship fit a different pattern entirely. The speed of his commitment, his consistent interest in my finances, his subtle encouragement for me to share responsibilities, his repeated insistence that long-term stability requires trust. It hadn't been romantic alignment. It had been operational preparation. I spoke again, my voice quieter now. So 6 months ago, they tried guardianship, I said. When that failed, they accelerated the marriage plan. Yes, Evelyn confirmed. And last night, I added slowly, they were preparing for the final step. There was a pause. Then she said, yes, liquidation. The word didn't need to be spoken. Because in financial fraud contexts, liquidation means converting protected assets into accessible cash before legal protections can reassert themselves. It meant speed. It meant coordination. It meant they were very close to executing their plan. And that realization triggered something deeply unsettling because it raised one critical question. If they had already failed once 6 months ago, why were they so confident they would succeed this time? I voiced the thought aloud. What changed? I asked. Evelyn's answer came slowly. Something happened 3 months ago, she said. My pulse spiked slightly. What? There was an internal review, triggered by an anonymous inquiry into your personal financial activity. I frowned. What kind of inquiry? Her voice was steady. Someone submitted documentation suggesting you were under significant undisclosed debt. I went completely still because that was impossible. I maintained meticulous financial records. I had 0 outstanding debt beyond a manageable mortgage, which meant one thing: the documentation had been fabricated. They tried to build the legal narrative of financial instability, I said quietly. Yes, she replied. A pattern consistent with long-term coercive asset access attempts. My mind raced now, because that meant they weren't just relying on marriage. They were building multiple fallback justifications simultaneously, which indicated something very specific. Desperation. High-stakes desperation. I exhaled slowly. Why would they be that desperate? Now I asked. There was a long pause on the line. Then Evelyn said something that shifted the entire situation into a far more dangerous territory. Because your parents are no longer financially stable themselves, she said. My heart skipped. What do you mean? Her voice dropped slightly. 3 years ago, your father made a series of undisclosed private investments that failed catastrophically. A cold wave spread through my chest. How catastrophic? I asked. Her answer came in one quiet sentence. He's currently carrying over $4.6 million in personal liability exposure. The number echoed in my mind. 4.6 million. That wasn't just financial trouble. That was collapse-level debt. And suddenly, everything snapped into place. The urgency, the coordination, the emotional hostility escalating in recent months. They weren't just resentful anymore. They were cornered. And when people with a history of fraud feel cornered, they don't always stop at legal boundaries. Before I could process further, Evelyn added one final sentence. Elena, she said carefully, there's something you need to know. My voice was steady, but my pulse was not. What? The reason your parents' last attempt 6 months ago failed, she paused, is because someone very close to you reported it to us. I went completely still because that meant someone inside my immediate circle had known what they were trying to do. Someone I trusted, someone who had been close enough to see the plan forming and had chosen to intervene. My mind moved rapidly through every possibility. Family, friends, colleagues. Ryan? No, it couldn't be Ryan. He was part of the plan, which meant the truth was even more unsettling. Because the only remaining possibility was someone I had never suspected. And then Evelyn said the name, a name that made my entire body go cold. "It was your brother," she said quietly. "Matthew Caldwell is the one who warned us." At 8:31 a.m., exactly 9 minutes after Evelyn Hawthorne told me my brother had secretly warned her firm about our parents' attempt to seize my inheritance, I realized something that didn't fit any pattern I had ever known. Matthew Caldwell had spent 26 years treating me like I didn't matter, and yet somehow he had been protecting me, silently, from the shadows. If that contradiction just made your mind pause for a second, imagine how it felt sitting there with the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same person. Because growing up, Matthew wasn't just distant. He was complicit. He laughed when our parents called me a mistake. He never defended me. He never intervened. He built his life on the same hierarchy that had placed him at the top and me at the bottom. So the idea that he had stepped in to stop them 6 months ago, it didn't just feel surprising. It felt impossible. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered that someone you believed was indifferent to you had been quietly protecting you all along? And if you did, would that change how you saw your entire past? Because in that moment, everything about my childhood suddenly felt less certain. I spoke carefully. "Are you absolutely sure it was him?" I asked. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "He contacted our office directly under confidentiality protection." My throat tightened slightly. "When?" "6 months ago," she repeated. "Shortly after your parents initiated the guardianship inquiry." That timeline aligned perfectly, which meant Matthew had intervened at the exact moment our parents tried to legally declare me incapable. Not after. Not once the plan escalated. At the earliest stage. That indicated something very specific. He had been watching them closely. I asked the question that had been building in my mind. "What did he say?" Evelyn's voice softened slightly. "He told us your parents were attempting to create false documentation about your financial stability," she said. "He provided evidence of internal family communications confirming their intentions." My pulse slowed into something heavy, because that meant Matthew hadn't just warned them verbally. He had delivered proof, which was an irreversible step. In legal terms, once someone submits documented evidence of attempted financial exploitation, they can never safely return to neutrality. They become a witness, an obstacle, a risk. I swallowed carefully. "Did my parents know he reported them?" I asked. "No," Evelyn said. "His identity remains confidential." That explains something I hadn't consciously noticed before. Over the past year, my parents' hostility toward Matthew had increased subtly. Not openly, but in the quiet ways families express internal fractures. Sharp comments, exclusion from certain conversations, unexplained tension at gatherings. At the time, I had assumed it was just typical family conflict. Now I realized something else. Matthew hadn't just been standing apart from me. He had been standing apart from them. For a long time, I ended the call with Evelyn at 8:45 a.m. promising to schedule an in-person meeting with her firm within the week. Then I sat alone at the table, staring at nothing, letting the silence settle into something I hadn't felt since childhood. Uncertainty. Because for 26 years, I had believed one narrative completely. Matthew was the golden child, the favored son, the one who never had to fight for anything. And now I was faced with the possibility that his silence hadn't meant indifference. It had meant something else. Distance. Calculated distance. Because in high-conflict family systems, there's a survival strategy that looks very similar to complicity. It's called strategic neutrality. You don't confront the abusers directly. You don't openly defend the target. You remain outwardly aligned, while quietly undermining harm behind the scenes. And suddenly, a memory surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. I was 17, packing for college. My mother had been furious that I chose Arizona State instead of staying home to attend a cheaper community college. "You're not worth that kind of investment," she had snapped. I had gone to my room and cried, silently, while folding clothes. Later that night, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No name, no note, just a cashier's check for $5,000. At the time, I never knew who left it. I assumed it was some administrative scholarship adjustment. But now, I realize something. Only one person in that house had both the means and the reason to do that quietly. Matthew. My chest tightened, not painfully, but with a slow, heavy recognition, because that meant he had been helping me long before 6 months ago, long before I ever realized it. And if that was true, then his silence all these years wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. At exactly 10:02 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Matthew. The timing made my pulse spike, because he almost never contacted me directly. We spoke maybe 3 times a year, briefly. Formally, the message was short. "We need to talk, today. Not at the house." My hands hovered over the screen, because if he had been secretly intervening to protect me, then meeting him now meant stepping into a truth I wasn't fully prepared to hear. Before I responded, another memory surfaced. 3 years ago, the night I told my family I was engaged to Ryan. Everyone had congratulated us politely. Everyone except Matthew. He had said only one thing that evening. "You should be careful about people who move too fast." At the time, I thought he was being cold, dismissive. Now I realized something chilling. He hadn't been dismissive. He had been warning me. I typed a reply slowly, where his response came almost immediately. "Old Hawthorne Building, 1 p.m. The name made my breath catch, because the Hawthorne Building wasn't just any location. It was the abandoned headquarters of my grandfather's company, vacant for over 20 years, a place my parents had never once allowed me to visit, a place connected to the inheritance they had tried to erase, which meant one thing. Matthew wasn't just ready to talk. He was ready to show me something. And as I set my phone down, a realization settled into my mind with quiet certainty. Whatever my brother had been hiding all these years, it was about to change everything I thought I knew about our family. Because people don't choose an abandoned corporate headquarters for a conversation unless the truth waiting there is bigger than words alone. At exactly 12:57 p.m., I parked my car in front of a 12-story glass building that had been abandoned for 21 years and realized this was the first time in my life I was standing in front of something that had once belonged to me. Not emotionally, legally. The faded steel letters still attached to the concrete facade read, "Hawthorne Industrial Systems." Most of the windows were dark. A few were cracked. The parking lot was empty except for a single black sedan I immediately recognized. Matthew's car. If you've ever walked into a place that carries the weight of your past before you even understand why it doesn't feel dramatic, it feels quiet, heavy, like stepping into a room where something important happened long ago and the air never fully moved again. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you found out your entire life had been shaped by secrets tied to a place you were never allowed to see, would you want to walk inside, or would you turn around and leave it buried? Because standing there in the midday Arizona sun, I knew I didn't have the option to walk away anymore. Not after everything I'd learned. I stepped out of the car. The front entrance doors were unlocked, which meant Matthew had already gone inside. That alone told me something. He wasn't just planning a conversation. He was preparing to show evidence, because no one brings you to an abandoned corporate headquarters unless the truth they're about to reveal needs physical context. The lobby smelled faintly of dust and old air conditioning vents. But despite the years of disuse, the building wasn't in disrepair. It had been maintained quietly, deliberately, which meant someone had been paying to preserve it. My pulse slowed into analytical focus. That someone was almost certainly the trust. At 1:02 p.m., I heard footsteps echo from the far end of the lobby. Matthew stepped into view. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because in 26 years, we had never once stood alone together in a place that belonged to neither of our parents. He looked older than I remembered, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "You came," he said simply. I nodded. "You said we needed to talk." He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "We do." Silence stretched between us, not hostile, but unfamiliar. Then he gestured toward the elevators. "Come on," he said. "There's something you need to see upstairs." We rode in silence to the 10th floor. The elevator still worked, which confirmed what I already suspected. This building hadn't been abandoned by accident. It had been preserved intentionally. As we stepped out, I saw something unexpected. The entire floor had been converted into a functioning office space. Lights on, modern desks, computers, file cabinets. It wasn't dusty at all. It looked active. I turned to him slowly. "This place isn't abandoned," I said. "No," he replied quietly. "It never was." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" He walked toward a large conference room with glass walls. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a minute to explain." I didn't sit immediately, because something in the air felt too significant, too controlled. "Start with one question," I said calmly. He nodded. "Okay." I held his gaze. "Why did you report Mom and Dad 6 months ago?" He didn't look away. "Because they crossed a line. They promised me they never would again." The phrase made my stomach tighten. "Again," I repeated quietly. He nodded once. "They tried to do something similar 26 years ago," he said. "And I was there when it happened." My pulse spiked, because that meant something impossible. "You were 4 years old," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And I remember more than they think." The room felt suddenly very still. "Remember what I asked?" He inhaled slowly, then said something that made my entire body go cold. "I remember the night Dad and Mom tried to force Grandpa to sign the incapacity documents," he said. "I was upstairs when they were arguing." My chest tightened. "Matthew," I whispered. His voice remained steady, but there was something heavy underneath it. "Grandpa wasn't sick," he continued. "He was fully lucid. They lied about his mental condition to take control of the company." I sat down slowly now, because hearing this from an external source was one thing. Hearing it from my brother, who had witnessed it, was another entirely. "They thought I was asleep," he said, "but I heard everything." He paused. "Dad told Mom that if Grandpa didn't sign voluntarily, they'd make sure he was declared legally incompetent." My hands clenched on the table, because that wasn't just fraud. That was attempted financial exploitation of an elder, a serious criminal offense. "What happened next?" I asked quietly. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. "Grandpa found out," he said, "and he cut them off immediately." I nodded slowly. "That part I know," I said. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You don't." My pulse spiked again. "What do you mean?" He looked directly at me. "Because there's something they never told you," he said. Silence filled the room like pressure building before a storm. Then he spoke. "Grandpa didn't just disinherit Mom because of the fraud attempt," he said. "He disinherited her because he discovered why she was so desperate to take control of the company in the first place." My throat tightened. Why, I asked. Matthew's next words landed like a quiet detonation. "Because Hawthorne Industrial Systems was about to be sold," he said, "for over $120 million. The number echoed in my mind. 120 million. Not 2, Not 5, 120, which meant something staggering. My parents hadn't just tried to steal control of a company. They had tried to intercept one of the largest private corporate sales in Arizona at the time. But Matthew wasn't finished. And the sale went through anyway, he said. I frowned. Then, where did the money go? He met my eyes. Into the trust. My breath caught, because that meant something extraordinary. The inheritance they had tried to seize decades ago wasn't just the current $2.8 million I knew about. That was only what remained after 26 years of controlled investment and protective legal structuring. And suddenly, I understood something else. This wasn't just about recovering a lost fortune. It was about something far more dangerous. Because people who had once tried to steal $120 million wouldn't simply give up after failing. They would wait, plan, adapt, and try again. Matthew leaned forward slightly. There's one more thing you need to know, he said. My voice was barely above a whisper. What? His eyes darkened in a way I had never seen before. 6 months ago, he said quietly, when I found out they were trying to access your trust again. He paused. I also discovered they weren't planning to stop at legal manipulation this time. My heart slammed against my ribs. What do you mean? Matthew held my gaze, and then said the sentence that changed everything once again. They were discussing a way to make sure you wouldn't be able to refuse. Silence filled the room, heavy, ominous, because there was only one way someone could ensure a person couldn't refuse a financial transfer. And it had nothing to do with paperwork. It had to do with control, permanent control. And for the first time since this entire truth began unfolding, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not anger, not grief, but fear. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about stopping a fraud. It was about understanding how far my own parents might be willing to go, now that they were desperate enough to lose everything. At 1:34 p.m., exactly 37 minutes after Matthew told me, our parents had been discussing a way to make sure I wouldn't be able to refuse signing away my inheritance. I realized something cold and unmistakable. This was no longer just a financial scheme. It was a containment plan. Because in forensic fraud cases, there's a critical shift investigators watch for the moment when perpetrators move from manipulation to immobilization. Not violence, not anything dramatic, but something quieter, something legally disguised, something that looks legitimate on paper while removing a person's ability to act freely. And suddenly, every strange detail from the past few months rearranged itself into a pattern that made my pulse slow into pure calculation. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you discovered someone close to you had been quietly preparing a legal pathway to control your life without your consent, would you confront them immediately? Or would you pretend you knew nothing and let them walk straight into their own trap? Because in that moment, sitting across from my brother in that silent conference room, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to let them continue. Matthew slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, he said quietly. My fingers rested on the cover, sure of what I asked. That they were serious, he replied. I opened the folder. Inside were printed email screenshots, financial memos, and one document that immediately made my chest tighten. A draft petition for emergency financial guardianship, filed under my full legal name, dated 3 weeks ago. My eyes scanned the contents quickly. The claim stated that I had been experiencing severe occupational burnout, financial mismanagement risk, and impaired decision-making capacity. All fabricated, all constructed to meet the legal threshold required for temporary asset control. But what made my pulse spike wasn't the lies. It was the attached supporting evidence. The petition included a psychological evaluation request, authorized by a physician, signed digitally. I looked up slowly. Who is this doctor? I asked. Matthew's jaw tightened. Ryan's business partner's brother, he said. He runs a private assessment clinic. The implications were immediate, because in Arizona, Emergency guardianship doesn't require full psychiatric commitment, only a professional evaluation stating temporary incapacity. And once granted, it allows designated guardians to make financial decisions on the individual's behalf for up to 90 days. 90 days is more than enough time to transfer and liquidate assets. I exhaled slowly. They weren't planning to force me physically, I said quietly. Matthew shook his head. No, he said. They were planning to do it legally, which was far more dangerous. Because legal immobilization doesn't look like an attack. It looks like concern, like protection, like family stepping in to help someone struggling. I turned the page. The listed emergency guardians were exactly who I expected. Daniel Caldwell, Patricia Caldwell, and secondary financial advisor Ryan Mitchell. My fiancé. The word felt foreign now. Clinical. Transactional. Matthew watched me carefully. I intercepted this before it could be filed, he said. I looked up sharply. How? He hesitated, then answered quietly. I have access to Dad's private legal server. That statement told me something I hadn't fully realized until now. Matthew hadn't just been passively observing. He had been actively monitoring them. For years. How long, I asked. He didn't look away. Since I was 22, he said. 14 years. The number settled heavily in my chest. Because that meant he had spent over half his life quietly tracking our parents' actions. Why? I asked softly. His answer came without hesitation. Because after what they tried to do to Grandpa, he said I knew they wouldn't stop when it came to money. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was clarifying. Because for the first time in my life, I understood Matthew's distance. He hadn't chosen neutrality. He had chosen surveillance. He had stayed close enough to watch them, close enough to intercept, close enough to protect me without exposing himself. And suddenly, a realization settled into my mind with quiet certainty. He had never been the golden child. He had been the quiet shield. I closed the folder slowly. They're desperate now, I said. Matthew nodded. Dad's financial exposure is worse than you know, he said. How bad, I asked. He exhaled slowly. He's facing personal bankruptcy within 18 months, he said. And if that happens, his professional reputation collapses, which meant everything made sense. The timing, the urgency, the escalating risk they were willing to take. They weren't just trying to recover wealth anymore. They were trying to survive. And desperate people don't stop easily. I leaned back slightly, so I said calmly, they think I don't know any of this. Matthew nodded. Yes, I met his eyes. Good. He blinked once. What do you mean? I felt something settle inside me. Cold, precise, controlled. The same mental state I enter when preparing to dismantle a corporate fraud operation. It means we don't stop them, I said quietly. His expression sharpened. Elena, we let them continue, I said. We let them think they're succeeding. Silence stretched between us. Then he understood. You want to build a case, he said. I nodded. Not just to protect the trust, I said. To expose everything. Because here's the truth about long-term financial predators. Stopping one attempt doesn't end the pattern. Exposure does. Public exposure, legal exposure, irreversible exposure. Matthew studied me carefully, then asked one final question. Are you ready for what that means? I didn't hesitate. Yes, because for 26 years, I had lived inside their narrative. The mistake, the defect, the disposable daughter. Now for the first time, I had the chance to control the narrative myself. And I wasn't going to do it quietly. I was going to do it strategically. I stood up slowly. When is the next big family event? I asked. Matthew answered immediately. Dad's law firm, anniversary gala, he said. 2 weeks from now. My pulse steadied into something sharp and focused. How many people will be there? Over 300, he said. Clients, partners, press. Perfect, because the most effective exposure doesn't happen in private. It happens in the exact environment where the perpetrators feel safest. I met his eyes. Then that's where we end this, I said quietly. Silence settled around us. Not uncertain, not fearful, final. Because in that moment, the plan became clear. We weren't just going to stop them from taking my inheritance. We were going to dismantle the entire illusion they had built for decades, in front of everyone who had ever believed their version of the truth. And as we walked out of the conference room together, one final realization settled into my mind. For 26 years, my parents had believed I was the mistake that ruined their future. In 2 weeks, they were going to learn something they had never considered. I wasn't their mistake. I was their consequence. At exactly 8:16 p.m., 2 weeks later, in a ballroom filled with 312 attorneys, corporate executives, and local media, my father raised a crystal glass to celebrate the 35th anniversary of Caldwell and Briggs, LLP, and had no idea that in less than 9 minutes, his entire career would begin collapsing in front of every person who mattered to him. I was standing 20 feet away when he started his speech. Calm, still, waiting, because exposure, when done correctly, isn't emotional. It's timed. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you had one chance to reveal decades of betrayal in front of everyone who had ever believed your abusers, would you make it loud or would you make it precise? Because what I was about to do wasn't revenge in the explosive sense. It was something far colder. It was controlled demolition. The ballroom glittered under chandeliers and camera flashes. Servers moved between tables, carrying trays of champagne. A large LED screen behind the stage displayed a polished slideshow of my father's career achievements. Awards, partnership milestones, community leadership recognitions, 35 years of carefully curated reputation. My father stood at the podium, confident and composed. Tonight, he said smoothly, we celebrate integrity trust and the values that define this firm. Integrity, the word hung in the air like an invitation. Beside me, Matthew stood quietly, hands clasped in front of him. On my other side, Evelyn Hawthorne sat in a wheelchair near the front row. Her presence officially listed as a longtime professional associate. No one in the room knew she was the legal architect of the trust my parents had spent decades trying to access. No one except us and the attorneys sitting quietly at a reserved table near the stage. The legal team we had assembled over the past 2 weeks, specialists in elder exploitation law, financial fraud prosecution, and bar disciplinary proceedings. This wasn't just an exposure, it was a coordinated legal trigger. My father continued speaking. When we founded this firm, we believed in protecting families, safeguarding assets, and upholding ethical responsibility. The irony was almost clinical, because every sentence he spoke reinforced the contrast that was about to shatter him. At exactly 8:24 p.m., he reached the final portion of his speech. And tonight, he said, smiling toward our table, I want to thank my family, especially my children, for their unwavering support. That was the cue. Matthew stepped forward first. He approached the stage calmly, holding a tablet. My father paused, mid-sentence, confused. Matthew, he said, what are you doing? Matthew's voice was steady. Just helping with the presentation, Dad, he said. He connected the tablet to the display system. The slideshow behind my father flickered, then changed. The screen went black, and a single document appeared. A scanned legal petition. Emergency guardianship filing. Elena Marie Caldwell. The room fell silent instantly, because even without context, legal documents displayed publicly carry a gravity that commands attention. My father froze. What is this? He demanded sharply. Matthew stepped back, then looked directly at him. You tell us, he said. Murmurs spread across the audience. My father tried to recover. This is some kind of misunderstanding, he said quickly. A private family matter. That was stage 1. Denial. Exactly as predicted. Then I stepped forward. The room quieted further, because most of the people present recognized me. They knew I worked in forensic accounting. They knew I wasn't someone who created scenes without evidence. I took the microphone calmly. This document, I said evenly, is a draft petition created 3 weeks ago to declare me financially incapable of managing my own assets. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My father's face tightened. Elena, he said sharply, this is inappropriate. I ignored him. Attached to that petition, I continued, are fabricated financial statements in a falsified medical evaluation request. The screen shifted. More documents appeared. Emails, financial records, internal communications, each one time-stamped, each one verified. The audience wasn't just shocked now. They were processing, because attorneys recognize evidence patterns immediately. And this pattern was unmistakable. My father moved forward, voice rising. This is being taken out of context, he said. We were trying to help you. There it was. Stage 2, deflection. Positioning himself as concerned, I met his gaze calmly. Help me access a trust you've been trying to control since before I was born, I asked. Silence crashed through the ballroom, because now the narrative had shifted completely. This wasn't a private dispute. It was a decades-long financial conflict. I gestured toward the front row. Evelyn Hawthorne, I said, would you please stand? She did slowly, supported by her assistant. The room reacted immediately. Several senior attorneys recognized her name because she had once been one of the most respected estate lawyers in the state. Her presence alone changed the weight of the situation. She spoke into a second microphone calmly. I established the Hawthorne Trust in 1999, she said, specifically to protect this beneficiary from documented attempts of financial coercion by her parents. The word documented echoed through the room like a verdict. My father's composure cracked for the first time. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Ancient history. Stage 3, minimization. But Matthew stepped forward again. He tapped the tablet. The screen changed once more. This time, it displayed something far more damaging. Audio transcripts, dated 6 months ago. My father's voice. Clear, unmistakable. Discussing strategies to declare me legally incapable. Discussing timing. Discussing liquidation pathways. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. My father's face drained of color. You recorded me, he said hoarsely. Matthew didn't flinch. I preserved evidence, he replied calmly. The distinction mattered legally. Recording laws in Arizona permit one-party consent, which meant the evidence was admissible. And at that moment, the final stage began. Collapse, because my father's voice broke when he spoke next. You don't understand, he said desperately. I was trying to save this family. Save. That word revealed everything. He wasn't denying anymore. He was rationalizing. And that's when I delivered the final statement, the one that ended any possibility of recovery. You didn't try to save this family, I said quietly. You tried to steal from it. Silence filled the room completely, because everyone present understood what that meant professionally. Financial exploitation, fraud, ethics violations, bar review triggers, irreversible consequences. My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the mistake, not as the defect, but as the one person who had just dismantled his entire life in less than 9 minutes. And as security approached the stage, guided by firm partners who were already making damage control decisions, I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the end, because exposure is only the public phase. The legal aftermath was just beginning. At 9:02 p.m., exactly 38 minutes after my father was escorted off the stage in front of over 300 colleagues, I stepped into a quiet corridor outside the ballroom and realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished, because exposure doesn't bring the rush people imagine. It brings silence and the slow settling of consequences that can never be reversed. If you've ever ended something that defined your entire life, not dramatically, but decisively, you know that feeling. It isn't loud. It's calm and strangely empty. Before I continue, let me ask you something. When the truth finally comes out after years of manipulation, Do you think justice feels satisfying? Or does it simply feel inevitable? Because standing there in that hallway, I understood something clearly. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. And corrections don't feel emotional. They feel final. Through the closed ballroom doors, I could still hear muffled voices, law firm partners, scrambling journalists, beginning to ask questions. Damage control already underway. Caldwell and Briggs, LLP, wasn't just a business. It was built on reputation. And reputation, once fractured publicly, doesn't heal. It fractures further. Matthew stepped into the hallway a moment later. He didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. Because we both knew what had just happened extended far beyond family conflict. This was a professional implosion. Finally, he said quietly, "The state bar investigators are already here." I nodded once. That was fast. He gave a small, humorless exhale. Allegations involving elder exploitation and falsified guardianship petitions trigger automatic review. That meant something very specific. This wasn't just internal firm discipline. It was formal legal investigation, licensing review, potential disbarment, which in my father's world was equivalent to identity collapse. Matthew leaned against the wall. "Mom's still inside," he said quietly. I didn't ask what she was doing, because I already knew the pattern. First denial, then blame, then victim positioning. Right on cue, the ballroom doors opened sharply. My mother stepped out. Her eyes were red, but not from grief. From rage. She walked straight toward me. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking. "You destroyed your own family." There it was. Stage 4. Victim reversal. I met her gaze calmly. "No," I said evenly. "I exposed what you did." Her face twisted. "You have no idea what we sacrificed for you," she snapped. Sacrificed. The word hung between us. And for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly for what it really meant. Not love, not protection, control disguised as obligation. I spoke quietly. "You didn't sacrifice for me," I said. "You resented me." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Because for once, there was no narrative left she could twist. No emotional leverage left to use. Only documented facts. She tried one final angle. "You think this makes you strong," she said bitterly. "You've just made yourself completely alone." The sentence might have hurt once, years ago. Now it didn't land at all. Because standing there in that quiet corridor, I realized something simple. I had been alone my entire life. I just hadn't recognized it before. So I answered calmly. "I'd rather be alone," I said, "than owned." The words settled into the air between us, like a boundary drawn in permanent ink. She stared at me for a long moment. Then something inside her seemed to collapse. Not emotionally, strategically. Because she finally understood something irreversible. There was no way back. No manipulation left. No reconciliation narrative possible. She turned and walked away without another word. And that was the last time I saw her. At 9:41 p.m., I sat with Evelyn Hawthorne and her legal team in a private conference room at the venue. The formal process had already begun. Trust activation, confirmation. Protective provisions initiated. Additional legal safeguards implemented. But the conversation wasn't about money. It was about closure. Evelyn looked at me with steady eyes. "You did exactly what your grandfather hoped you would," she said quietly. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "He always believed the greatest protection wasn't legal structures," she said. "It was clarity." Clarity? The word resonated deeply. Because for 26 years, my life had been shaped by confusion, uncertainty, self-doubt. Now, for the first time, everything was clear. Not just about my parents, but about myself. Matthew joined us shortly afterward. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood near the window, looking out over the city lights. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "You protected me the only way you could." He turned toward me, and now he asked. The question carried more weight than it seemed. Because it wasn't just about legal outcomes. It was about what came after. I thought for a moment, then answered honestly. Now I said quietly, I stopped living in reaction to them. The room fell silent. Not uncomfortable, peaceful. Because for the first time in my life, there was nothing left to fight. Nothing left to prove. Only space. At exactly 11:12 p.m., as I stepped outside into the cool desert air, my phone buzzed with a notification. An official email from the Arizona State Bar. Subject line, immediate suspension notice. Daniel Robert Caldwell. I read it once, then closed the screen. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't define me anymore. And as I stood there, under the quiet night sky, I realized something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the end of a burden. The only thing left now was learning how to live without carrying it. But there was still one final truth I hadn't fully faced yet. Because while exposure had ended my parents' control over my future, it hadn't answered the most important question of all. What does a life look like when you finally stop trying to earn love from people who were never capable of giving it? At 6:12 a.m., exactly 19 days after the night, my father lost his law license and my family's illusion collapsed in front of the entire legal community. I stood alone on the rooftop terrace of the Hawthorne building and watched the Arizona sunrise spill slowly across the desert. For the first time in 26 years, no one knew where I was. No one was watching me. No one was evaluating me. And most importantly, no one was waiting for me to prove anything. If you've ever spent your entire life trying to earn approval that never came, you might think freedom feels dramatic. It doesn't. It feels quiet, like the absence of noise you didn't even realize had been there all along. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If the people who defined your identity, your entire life, suddenly lost all power over you, would you know who you actually are without them? Because that turned out to be the hardest part. Not exposing the truth, not surviving the betrayal, but learning how to exist without the constant weight of trying to be enough. The city below was just beginning to wake traffic, moving slowly, the faint hum of morning activity rising into the air. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of coffee and let the quiet settle into something steady. The legal aftermath had unfolded exactly as expected. My father's disbarment became permanent within 11 days after formal review, confirmed documented ethical violations. Caldwell and Briggs, LLP, dissolved its partnership structure within 2 weeks. Several senior partners reformed under a new name, publicly distancing themselves from him. My mother filed for divorce shortly afterward. Not out of remorse, out of survival, because once his professional reputation collapsed, the financial stability she had relied on for decades disappeared with it. Matthew kept me informed in brief, factual updates. No commentary, no emotional framing, just the same quiet steadiness he had shown his entire life. Our relationship didn't suddenly become warm or close. That wasn't realistic, but something fundamental had changed. There was no longer a wall between us, only space. And that was enough. The trust activation process completed quietly, without public attention. Most of the assets remained exactly where they had always been protected, invested stable. I didn't withdraw large sums. I didn't make dramatic lifestyle changes, because that money had never represented freedom in the way people imagine. It represented something much simpler: security, choice, time to build a life based on my own decisions, rather than reactions to someone else's expectations. And that was the real inheritance my grandfather had protected. Not wealth, autonomy. A soft breeze moved across the rooftop, carrying the dry warmth of the desert morning. I closed my eyes briefly, and for the first time in my life, a memory surfaced that didn't hurt. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while my parents argued in another room. Matthew had walked in quietly, placed a glass of water beside me, and said only one thing: You don't have to listen to them. At the time, I thought he meant the argument. Now, 20 years later, I understood what he had really meant. I didn't have to listen to the story they told about who I was. The mistake, the defect, the burden, none of it had ever been true. Those labels had only existed because they needed them to. Because acknowledging my value would have meant confronting their own actions. And people who build their lives on denial rarely do that. My phone buzzed softly on the table beside me. A message from Matthew. You should see this. Attached was a short article from a local legal publication. The headline read, "Former partner disbarred after ethics investigation into financial exploitation attempt." No dramatic language, no sensationalism, just facts. The way truth looks once the emotional noise fades away. I read it once, then set the phone down. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined me. A few minutes later, footsteps sounded behind me. I turned to see Evelyn Hawthorne being wheeled slowly onto the rooftop by her assistant. She looked at me with the same steady, knowing expression she had carried since the first moment we spoke. "This was always your grandfather's favorite place," she said quietly. I looked around. "The rooftop," she nodded. "He used to come up here at sunrise when he needed to think clearly," she said. "He believed perspective matters most when you're above the noise." I smiled faintly. "That sounds right." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise fully over the horizon. Then she said something that settled into my chest with unexpected warmth. "He never thought of you as something he had to protect," she said. I looked at her. "What did he think?" She smiled gently. "He thought of you as the one person who would eventually end the cycle." End the cycle. The words resonated deeply, because that was what this entire journey had really been about. Not revenge, not money, not even justice. It had been about breaking something that had existed long before I was born. The pattern of control, of manipulation, of love treated as a transaction. And standing there in the quiet morning light, I realized something simple but profound. Ending a cycle doesn't feel like victory. It feels like peace. I took a slow breath, then exhaled. And for the first time in my life, the silence inside my mind wasn't heavy. It was calm. I wasn't the mistake. I wasn't the consequence. I was simply free. If you've ever had to walk away from people who could never love you the way you deserved, you already know this truth. Closure isn't about them understanding what they did. It's about you no longer needing them to. And as the sun rose higher, casting warm light across the rooftop, I picked up my coffee and turned toward the future. Not reacting, not proving, just living. So now, I want to ask you one final question. Have you ever had to choose between keeping a toxic family connection or protecting your own peace? Because in the next story, I'm going to tell you about a woman who discovered her entire family had secretly been living off a trust fund in her name and the shocking way she exposed them. But for now, this chapter of my life was finally closed.